It's so wonderful to see this really phenomenal gathering, which I truly think is just intergenerational, and to see everyone breaking bread and enjoying the beginning of what is, I think, a true celebration of Fran. So welcome to this year's distinguished faculty lecture, and we do have an exceptional program for you today. I am Paul Johnson, president of Wellesley, and the Distinguished Faculty Lecture was established in 1999 to provide an opportunity for the college's accomplished and widely admired faculty members to deliver a public lecture with the goal of helping the community to reflect on the meaning of a liberal arts education. The lecture provides us with a comprehensive view inside a faculty member's area of expertise and how that scholarship informs and is informed by a topic of wider interest to all. It's my great pleasure to introduce this year's speaker, Frances, or as we affectionately call her, Fran Malino, the Sophia Moss Robeson Professor of Jewish Studies and History. She's a highly respected and beloved faculty member whose nearly 3-decade career at Wellesley has been marked by both important, award-winning scholarship in her field. She's an authority on Jewish and European history, as well as a legacy of leadership and service to the college. As the inaugural chair of the Jewish Studies program at Wellesley, Professor Malino shaped, expanded, and built a community around what has been, from its start, a thriving area of study at Wellesley. She teaches wide-ranging courses in Jewish history and the history of anti-Semitism, with courses that look back as far as medieval times. Generations of students have benefited from her ability to bring into focus the global experience of the Jewish people and their history and culture, all within a critical historical context. Her popular course, Roots of Exile, Jews and Muslims, highlights key areas of her scholarship, including the often unheard stories between diasporic and marginalized communities. The author and co-editor of 8 books, Professor Malino is an internationally celebrated scholar. In 2012, the French government named her a Chevalier of the Ordre de Palme Académique in recognition of her distinguished academic research and instruction in French history, particularly her career-spanning study of Jewish history in France. Professor Malino's talents also lie in her ability to build bridges and strengthen community across the campus, in particular, organizing programs that showcase the various ways Jewish studies enrich a liberal arts curriculum. In just one example of such a program, Muslims, Jews, and Christians came to campus to collaborate peacefully through music in Houghton Chapel. It brought together Middle East studies, Jewish studies, religion, history, music, Spanish, peace and justice studies, and medieval and Renaissance studies. Professor Malino's vision and dedication led Wellesley to partner with the nonprofit organization Digital Heritage Mapping to create an initiative called Dianna, and that means our homes in Judeo-Arabic. Dianna is a multinational and interfaith collaboration of scholars, experts, and artists who travel the world and visit historical sites, collect archival and contemporary photographs and films, interview elderly community residents, and more. They then share the material in myriad educational formats. Their purpose, very simply, is to preserve Jewish history in its many forms. Under Professor Malino's guidance, many Wellesley students and recent alumni have been active in all aspects of the Dianna Project, often traveling to cities in North Africa and the Middle East. We are especially fortunate to have Professor Malino as this year's Distinguished Faculty Lecturer, because this affords us a remarkable opportunity to look back on her impact on Wellesley and the history of Jewish studies at the college. Today's lecture is the culminating event in a series of 3 lectures that have taken place over the course of the spring semester to mark the 30th anniversary of the chair in Jewish studies at Wellesley. These lectures show the different facets of Jewish studies, from history to literature to its interdisciplinary approach. In commemorating this important milestone, we honor the important role the Jewish people, culture, and religion has played throughout history and across the globe. And we honor the many Jewish alumni who saw a need for the endowment of the chair and who so generously funded and supported it. Wellesley is so privileged to have alumni who are devoted stewards, committed to Wellesley's continued academic excellence, just as we are fortunate to have key faculty members who worked in concert with these alumni, because they too could envision the many ways that this endowed chair would add to the Wellesley experience for us all. In her lecture, Jewish Voices, Muslim Lands, Fran will reflect on the history of Jewish studies, the Jewish Studies program at Wellesley, as well as to discuss her most recent research, which has uncovered thousands of letters from Jewish women who lived in the early 20th century. She will explore the complex and inspiring lives of these young Jewish women who traveled to France to train in schools and then returned to North Africa and the Middle East to teach. Her presentation shines a light on facets of Jewish history that are often understudied, and in the process deepens our understanding of the 19th and early 20th century France and the experience of colonized people. Please help me welcoming to the podium this year's distinguished faculty lecturer, Professor Fran Malino.
Thank you. Thank you, President Johnson, for your kind words and for your continued support of Jewish studies at Wellesley. I look around me at so many of you here, and I see friends, colleagues, students, past and present, some of whom have come from California and elsewhere, up north in Maine, and my dear family, including Olivia and Aiden, 2 of my grandchildren. And I look around at all of you and I'm truly overwhelmed by an embarrassment of riches. And I thank you for coming and sharing this precious moment with me. Today, what I plan to do is to present a triptych of sorts. The central frame will be a discussion of my research on Jewish women teachers in North Africa and the Middle East. I'll also introduce you, as President Johnson has done so well, to Dianna, and take you on a brief virtual tour of Jewish sites in North Africa and the Middle East, including some of the schools in which the teachers taught. But before I do all this, I thought it might be fun to share vicariously in the enthusiasm surrounding the establishment of the chair in Jewish studies 29 years ago. So I'd like us to return to Jewett, but to return to Jewett in 1990. And we will experience very briefly the thoughts of Nan Cohen, Dale Marshall, and then my father, Rabbi Malino.
It's an extremely happy and auspicious day for Wellesley today, and we're so glad that so many of you are able to be here to celebrate it with us. It is certainly a historic occasion for any institution to establish a new professorship. For Wellesley to establish a professorship in Jewish studies at this time is a particularly happy and celebratory event. It seems almost unbelievable that we've waited so long when one looks back at the centuries of Jewish history that have contributed so much to the fundamental values of Western civilization. And so with a sense of great elation, I introduce Professor Fran Malino to you and thereby install her as the first holder of this chair that so many of you have attached so much hope to, and I can tell you that your hopes are well fulfilled and they are just beginning to be visible to everyone on the community, and I expect very great things from Professor Fran Malino, and it's a pleasure to install you, Fran. At this point, to introduce Rabbi Jerome Malino, who will deliver the closing tribute.
Thank you very much for so gracious an introduction. Many years ago, Senator Ribicoff was introduced at an anniversary dinner in my congregation, so fulsomely by the young attorney who introduced him that we thought perhaps he was going to be nominated for the presidency of the United States and not merely invited to give an address at a congregational anniversary dinner. Ribicoff was not fazed. He didn't even hesitate a moment. He said, "I'm terribly sorry that my parents are not here at this moment. My father would have enjoyed everything that was said, and my mother would have believed it." Now, I recalled this story as I sat and listened to the introduction that was given to Dr. Frances Malino in the presence of both her mother and her father. And I could say, although I did not take the trouble to check with my wife for the accuracy of my statement, that we both believed and enjoyed every moment that we heard. I might say that there have been many academic laurels earned by the children in our family. But if I may mix a metaphor, this occasion, dear Francis, is the jewel in the laurel wreath. And for us, and apparently for everyone here, it marks a significant moment not only in our family life, but in the life of Wellesley College. When I was ordained 55 years ago, I must confess to you, I could have counted on the fingers of one hand all of the colleges and universities in the United States that had chairs in Judaic studies. Now, neither my hands, nor my toes, nor even my mathematical competence at this particular moment can tell you how many hundreds of institutions of higher learning there are where Judaic studies or Jewish studies, the distinction is not of consequence, where Judaic studies are part of the formal curriculum of these institutions. And so it should be, because in the realm of learning, in the pursuit of knowledge, there should be no boundaries, there should be no narrow distinctions, there should only be a total freedom to pursue knowledge wherever it may be found. And that is also part of the joy of this moment. Because here at Wellesley College, an esteemed and prestigious institution of learning in this country, there is now a formal chair in Jewish studies, although, as it has been pointed out, studies in Judaism have not by any means been alien to the curriculum here at Wellesley. I conclude where I began. It is a day of great personal joy and a day of signal meaning for Wellesley College.
It was so long ago, and yet it feels like yesterday, and I see around me a number of people here who were there 29 years ago and no doubt remember listening to my father. Over these last 30 years, the vision expressed by Nan Cohane, by Dale Marshall, by my father, that vision has informed our Jewish Studies program with its more than 40 courses, programs, as President Johnson has said, which have been co-sponsored with other departments and other programs, conferences, an international symposium to celebrate the 10th anniversary of Jewish Studies, which was published by Northeastern Press, titled Voices of the Diaspora, Jewish Women Writing in the New Europe. For that symposium, we invited Jewish women from France, from Spain, from Holland, from Russia, from Italy, to our Wellesley campus. These were Jewish women writers, all of whom were born after the Holocaust. And they came for a few days to read from their works, but also to answer questions about what it was like to be Jewish, a Jewish woman writing in the New Europe. But perhaps most important of all have been our Jewish Studies alumni. I don't have the time, and the constraints are operative, to detail their truly fell-worthy careers. But let me say that they too, in so many ways and in such disparate places, have helped fulfill our vision for Jewish Studies. And now I'm going to turn to the second part, which is a presentation of my research. And this research serendipitously also led to the founding of Digital Heritage Mapping and Dianna. A number of summers ago, I arrived at the archives in Paris of the Alliance Israélite Universelle, and I was met with incredible news. Archives, which had presumed to have been lost forever, had just been returned from Moscow. You might wonder, what were they doing in Moscow? Well, at the outbreak of the Second World War, when the Nazis came to France, occupied France, one of the first buildings they took over was the building of the Alliance Israélite Universelle. And the huge library at the Alliance and the vast archival collection was taken by the Nazis and brought to Frankfurt. But on the top floor of the Alliance, in the huge office of the Secrétaire Général, were boxes and boxes of personal information about Alliance teachers, dossiers detailing where they came from, where they were now posted, personal information of all sorts. And the members of the Alliance feared that this personal information would get into the hands of the Nazis. And so right before the Germans took over the building, boxes of archives from this third floor were put on trucks and sent to the free zone. From then on, it's conjecture as to what happened. But we suspect that the material was confiscated by the Germans, brought to Germany. It surfaced in Berlin at the end of the Second World War, was taken by the Russians, and ended up in Soviet archives. And I see Nina here, so she knows Soviet archives were often developed in order to prevent people from seeing them, material. So this material was not seen. It was in pristine condition. It was returned after I had begun my research. Had these archives been there when I began my research, my project would have probably gone in a different direction and would definitely have taken less time. Before I discuss the details of my project, for those of you who are not aware of the Alliance, I'm just going to introduce the first international philanthropic organization to you. In June 1860, the first call for the Alliance was issued, and there were two catalysts triggering this call. One was the Damascus blood libel of 1840, in which Jews in Damascus were accused of the ritual murder of a monk. And the other was the Mortara kidnapping case in 1858, when a Jewish child, presumably, although it's not clear he actually was, converted by his nursemaid, was taken by the Inquisition and would not be released by the Pope to his family. So these were the events that were triggering this call in 1860 by 6 young, acculturated French Jews. And they were heeding, they believed, the rabbinic saying, Kol Yisrael Arevim ze bazeh, all Jews are responsible one for another. And I'll read you just a couple of sentences from their call. And as you'll see, these sentences really evoke mid-19th century France every bit as much as they do the history of the Jews in France in that last half century during which they were emancipated. And this is from the call. If you believe that a great number of your co-religionists, overcome by 20 years of misery, of insults and prohibitions, can find again their dignity as men, win the dignity of citizens. If you believe that one should enlighten those who have been blinded and not abandon them, raise those who have been exhausted and not rest with pitying them, defend those who have been calumnied and not remain silent, rescue all those who have been persecuted, and not only talk about the persecution. If you believe in all these things, Jews of the world, come hear our appeal, join our organization, and give us your help. There were 2 mandates for the Alliance. One was through diplomatic lobbying, the Alliance would seek to come to the aid of Jews everywhere, whether this was in Eastern Europe, or in Switzerland, or in North Africa, or in the Middle East. The other mandate the Alliance set for itself was the establishment of modern, intellectually rigorous schools for boys and girls, modeled after the French school system, which had recently become, or was in the process of becoming secularized. A network of schools which would be established throughout North Africa and the Middle East, in order to, and I'm using their term, regenerate the Jews living there vocationally, spiritually, and morally. By the First World War, the Alliance had 30,000 members. In fact, there was a group in Keokuk, Iowa. I have no idea where Keokuk, Iowa is, but there was my son-in-law says he's from Iowa. There were 43,700 students enrolled in 183 schools, which were set up from Tetuan in northern Morocco all the way to Teheran in present-day Iran. I first became interested in the Alliance, which was far from my earlier research in 18th century France, while rereading a book of a friend of mine, which was on the Alliance, and I came across a footnote, very brief. So far, there has been only one study devoted to the female teachers of the Alliance. The study listed was 13 pages long. I immediately called Aaron, my friend, and asked him if this was still the case. He said, yes, indeed. He also, as did others of my colleagues, suggested that there really wasn't a lot of information about these women teachers, certainly not a lot of personal information. I decided, a little bit of a stubborn soul that I am, that I wouldn't heed their advice. And the following summer, I would go to Paris, to the archives of the Alliance, and see whether it was possible to rescue the lives of these hundreds of women who were teaching in this network of schools from the 19th century through to after the Second World War. So let me digress for one more minute and tell you who were these teachers. Well, originally, the Alliance presumed that the teachers would come from France. The schools were going to be following the French curriculum, and the language of instruction was French. But few were the people, men or women, who wanted to volunteer to teach in schools in towns and villages in North Africa and the Middle East. So the Alliance had another idea. Why not choose the brightest of and the term they used, alas, was Orientals, which had at the time and continues to have a pejorative inference of primitiveness and exoticism. Why not choose the brightest of the Orientals, bring them to Paris, educate them in France, have them take French teaching exams, and then we will send them back to North Africa and the Middle East to teach in our schools. And the Moscow archives that were returned later have the letters of recommendation for these students, the medical exams, the forms that the parents had to sign to let their 14-year-old children go away for at least 4 years, and also the exams that these young people took to show that they were indeed intelligent enough to go to Paris and be trained in a normal school. As missionaries for the regeneration of their fellow Jews, the Alliance teachers were to be both its product and also the vectors for its success. 4 years after studying in Paris, they never went home during this time, with French teaching degrees and degrees in Hebrew and in Jewish history, the teachers returned to North Africa and the Middle East, 19 years of age. They were never, after very early on when it was shown to be problematic to return to your hometown, they were never returned to their place of birth. And let me give you a quote from one of these young teachers as she leaves to set up her position in North Africa. "We disembark in a city of the Orient or of Africa, which is unknown to us. In effect, according to the laudable and prudent, but not agreeable traditions of the Alliance's Central Committee, those who come from Haifa are sent to Smyrna, while the Tunisians are sent to Egypt. It is necessary to install oneself, look for a room, a pension. Neither mother nor older sister guides us. Besides, not having earned our first trimester salary, we have no funds. We are isolated and miserable, with no relations and no friends. Interrogate my colleagues, ask them if exhausted by the first weeks of teaching, not yet broken into a profession which taxes the brain no less than the lungs, they have not cried secretly in the evening, alone in their room, furnished with the 4 traditional pieces of furniture bequeathed by the teacher whom they have just replaced." Well, the teachers were not without guidance. In fact, there was a 133-page manual, which was given to each one, prepared by Jacques Bigard, who was the Secrétaire Général of the Alliance. I refer to him as the Ministry of Education of One. He was involved in every aspect of the Alliance and every aspect of the lives of the Alliance teachers. And the manual that they received clarified to the teachers their responsibilities, and told them how many hours each subject was to be taught in each grade, gave them the syllabi, and made it quite clear to them that they were not to act independently in any way that was of importance without getting the permission of Jacques Bigard. Important for my research, the Alliance teachers were also required to write to the Alliance at least once a month. And these letters were on special stationery and detailed the schools, the students, the community, and whatever else was going on. Significantly, if a teacher failed to follow the rules and regulations, they were fined, sent to a different position, or possibly let go, and then had to pay back the money that had been spent in their education. That's the introduction. Now back to my summer in Paris. What did I find? I decided arbitrarily to choose 5 women who had gone to the pension of Madame Isaac. When the young girls came to Paris at the age of 14, they were sent either to the École Bischofsheim, which was a vocational school, or to two pensions run by two different women, Madame Isaac and Madame Veil-Khan. And Madame Isaac seemed to me to run the top school of the three, so I decided to just arbitrarily pick three women and see what I could find in the archives to perhaps be able to put together the complexity of their lives, their goals, their accomplishments. So the first woman I came across, Lucia Varia, I followed her from her birth and place in Salonika to Alexandria, to Rhodes, to Bursa. It was all very interesting. I was finding wonderful material. And then I came to my second one, who was Claire Benchimol. At the time, I didn't know that the Benchimol family is featured in Delacroix portraits, but this was much later information to me. And I started reading about Claire, and I got more and more excited by my intimacy with this young woman who is utterly brilliant, who scored the top score in France, in France of the year she took the French teaching exams. She was ferociously independent, and she reminded me of an academic. If she had lived in our generation, she definitely would have gone on to get a PhD. I followed her to Tetuan. She was one of the earliest of the teachers, and she was allowed to return to her place of birth. She married, she had children. I followed all the interactions with the community. And I got to know her so well that I knew that every time she had a child, she had fibroids and nearly died, and that there was a wonderful Dr. Berliowski from Eastern Europe who continually saved her life each time she gave birth. She then finally, and I was discovering all this in bits and pieces, taking the bus to the archives every day, she then finally, after an altercation in Tetuan, was sent to Tripoli with her husband and children. And I started shaking on the way to the archives because I thought there's no Dr. Berliowski to save her in Tripoli. In fact, there was no doctor in Tripoli. And at the age of 35, Claire died in childbirth. And I'd like to share with you just the words of her sister, Allegrina. Words are too weak to describe the intensity of our sadness. We are driven crazy, and I am still asking myself if this terrible death is not just a nightmare which will soon be over. How do we answer these poor little orphans who cry for their mother and who tear one's heart out by their childish logic? How do we draw the moral force necessary to withstand this severe test? How do we console ourselves with such an irreparable loss? The entire city is in mourning for my poor and dear sister, and all her pupils are crying for her. My dear mother, already so sorely tried, forces herself to hide her sadness in order not to revive ours. What this tells you is I was finding more than the formal letters of this is what's going on in the community. In fact, I found thousands of letters, still stuck together with rusting straight pins, which were written by these women, not every month to report to the Alliance, but processing their experiences as teachers in North Africa and the Middle East. Based on what I realized was a veritable treasure trove, I decided that I would, in fact, devote the next few years to exploring the lives of these Alliance teachers. And I thought that rather than do it globally, I would do it by constructing a multi-generational portrait of the Benchimol family, because I really didn't want to leave Claire. I wanted to know what happened to her 4 children. I wanted to know what happened to her sister. And so this multi-generational portrait would be the mother, the sisters, Claire, her sister Allegrina, her sister Hasiba, and her sister Sol, and Claire's 3 daughters, who also became Alliance teachers. I'd include a cousin, and I was also going to include a student of Claire's. So that would be the group that I would explore. And between them, these women founded and directed Alliance schools in 12 different cities in North Africa and the Ottoman Empire. time, of course, and I'm going to look at it, time does not permit me to go into detail about any one of these women. What I'd like to do, however, is to highlight a few of the issues that they encountered and the sort of results of their activities which were not intended by the Alliance. So I'm going to just tell you briefly whom I'm going to be talking about. So Claire, I have already introduced. Hasiba was her sister 6 years younger, very different from Claire, self-declared feminist, and Claire was committed to the cultural traditions of Tetuan. Hasiba was more committed to France and French culture. She was extremely brilliant, but also unfortunately plagued by the bipolar disease that her father had suffered from. Hasiba was the founder and director of a school in Fez, Larache in Morocco, 2 cities in Macedonia, and Casablanca, from which she retired in 1924. Allegrina was the sister who wrote the letter I read to you. This was the younger sister of Claire. She was the most committed, I think, to the Alliance, although not uncritically so. She had an ebullient personality, one that everyone cherished and treasured. And the last is Masodi Pariente, who came from Tetuan as well, was an assistant to Claire, and who carried her piano wherever she went, reminded me of one of the films, until it was ultimately destroyed in Fez in 1912. And Masodi Pariente also was the aunt of a very famous Moroccan writer, Moroccan Jewish writer, Aman El Maleh, and she tutored him for a number of years when he was unable to go to school. All of these women that I'm going to talk about for the next 15 minutes married Alliance teachers. All had children of their own, except for Allegrina, who out of love for her sister Claire, married Claire's husband and took care of the 4 children as if they were hers. All lived through wars and epidemics of cholera and typhoid. In fact, they all had typhoid. All suffered miscarriages. All were intellectually gifted, and all were consummate letter writers. So I had a lot of archival material to explore. So let me highlight a few of the issues that these teachers encountered. And I'm purposely highlighting issues that are gendered issues. So the first, which was a serious issue, was child marriage. And the dilemma was, these were primary schools, the dilemma was if girls were getting married at 7 or 8 years of age, and you didn't admit them into your school, you were condemning them to be illiterate. If you did admit them, you were condoning a practice which the Alliance teachers found abhorrent, and it was a dilemma. But as common as early marriage was, it was different in each town and city. So in Tetuan, for example, early marriages were only really arranged by the poor who couldn't afford a dowry, and the age of the child being young, it was more valuable. Whereas in Fez, the arrangement was more done by wealthy families who wanted to ensure that the wealth in the family remained intact. I'll read you just briefly from Claire to give you a sense of the dilemma. She's describing one of her pupils. Miriam Shwaran has left the school today. In spite of her youth, her parents are going to marry her in 3 months. The poor child does not want to separate herself either from her classmates or from the teachers. And the day that she said goodbye to us, she cried warm tears, so much did she regret leaving. And Claire sought out the child's mother. Why, I asked her, was she so pressed to marry her daughter? What else can I do, she explained. Today someone came requesting my daughter without demanding a dowry or trousseau. We are poor, and I cannot afford to wait. only to find that I myself must then search for a husband. And Claire, asking herself how she could respond to such reasoning, concluded civilization alone will be able to make this disappear, but we will have to wait so very long. Everything goes slowly, but this will go at the speed of a tortoise. Another of the issues that the teachers confronted was the teaching of Hebrew. Again, there was a common theme. It was difficult to find rabbis who were willing to teach Hebrew to young girls. But then each town and city had problems of its own. In Tetuan, for example, there was a great deal of emigration of young men to Algeria first and then to Argentina. So there were few men available. And those who were available, according to Claire, were unable to teach Hebrew as a coherent language. For Hasiba in Fez, it was a very different problem. There was not the emigration that went on in Tetuan, but the problem was it was a more traditional community. And no one wanted a rabbi, if he was young, to be surrounded by young girls. And so Hasiba eventually found a wonderful way of dealing with this dilemma. We cannot engage a young rabbi for the school, nor one of middle age, for the parents would take their daughters out of the school. We have to have an old man, and Monsieur Dizini is the only one who, in spite of his years, can still work. His method of teaching does not satisfy me. I cannot trust him with a class, for he is incapable of establishing discipline. I therefore, and this is her solution, have him teach Hebrew during dressmaking under my personal surveillance. Relations with the communities also were problematic. There were strains between the community's traditional values and the values held by or presumed to be held by these teachers. Not so very different from what the institutrices of France encountered when they went to the provinces in the 19th, turn of the 20th century. They were seen as representing Republican values in these traditional communities. So, for example, when Claire was trying to raise money to feed the impoverished children in her school, the Talmud Torah in the town would happily give money to feed boys, but not give money to feed girls, even though the food was being prepared in the girls' school. There were also barriers of language, even in the same country. Claire and her sisters did not know Arabic. They spoke Haketia, which is a mix of Spanish with some Hebrew and a little bit of Arabic, but not much. And the rest of Morocco spoke Arabic. And so when Hasiba was sent to Fez, she could not communicate with the mothers of her students, and in fact got some really important things wrong because she presumed, being an avowed feminist, that it was the fathers who were doing certain things when in fact at times it was the mothers. There was also the difficulty of disciplining students. Fathers didn't want to have their children disciplined by a woman, and often would appear at the school. In one instance with Claire, appeared at the school and physically threatened her, and that led to a miscarriage. Almost all of the teachers had issues and were at one point or another assigned to a different post, because they had to demonstrate their moral authority in the community, which leads me to say what, in fact, were the relations between these teachers and the Alliance. As one would predict, they were not simple, they were not easy, they were complicated, they were contested. Also, relations between the teachers and the organization of the Alliance in Paris shifted as the teachers matured. Shifted when Bigard died in 1934 and there was no one micromanaging anything, and shifted when colonial authorities became more and more involved in the operation of these Alliance schools, which happened certainly for Morocco at the turn of the century. So as students in Paris, you can imagine what the relationship of the students would be, the young girls would be, to the Alliance. They were totally dependent on the Alliance for everything. Yes, their school books. Yes, whatever little money they were given to buy treats for themselves. they also had to ask the Alliance for bras if they needed them. So it was, the Alliance became in place of parents, and the Alliance girls were somewhat like dutiful daughters. Subsequently, as young adults, the teachers could not escape feeling underappreciated, frustrated by the direction of the Alliance, and certainly frustrated by begisn letting them know always how things could be different or better. And the teachers often lost their way. They also often challenged what the Alliance was suggesting they need do, and whether the goals that the Alliance set out to regenerate the Jews of North Africa and the Middle East were the right goals to begin with. And let me share Allegrina's statement. There is a particular sadness in leaving Tripoli. Patience, energy, perseverance, an unfailing devotion, these are the qualities which made our stay almost eternal. We have worked so hard and struggled a great deal. Yet what will remain of all this? Will one sincerely love what we have done in the end? Nevertheless, in striking contrast to the teachers, the institutrices of the metropole of France, the Alliance teachers emerged as ferociously independent, willing to and often succeeding in defying the Central Committee of the Alliance. Let me give you a couple of examples and then explore for a few minutes why it was that, in contrast to what the Alliance intended, it managed to produce these ferociously independent women teachers. Example one, this is 1893, and Claire is 21 in Tetuan, and there have been some events taking place nearby concerning the Spanish, and Claire is frightened that there might be some civil war or war itself. And Bigat tried to calm her, but also suggested that he would like to see more courage from the director of the school. Claire's response hid neither her annoyance that someone in his nice armchair in the 9th arrondissement in Paris was telling her to be calm, but also her ferociously independent assertion that she could make the decision. She was on the ground. And this is in her letter. I see from what you have said that my letter has led you to believe that natural female weakness alone has led me to write to you in this manner. Do not believe for one moment that I exaggerate the situation. It suffices to be here for a few days to get an idea of the alarming state of the population. I can say without flattering myself too much that in this situation I have been, and I still am, braver than many of the men. Hasiba had the same attitude. She was annoyed when she was accused of lacking flexibility in her interactions with the community of Larache, and sent back a short note, have I arrived after 5 years as director and with all my experience in the service to receive from you this reproach, so little merited? So these are 19, 20, 21, 22-year-olds letting the Paris Central Committee know that what they thought they understood in Paris was not what was happening in North Africa and the Middle East. And finally, before I share with you how the reasons for what I see as the reasons for this autonomy, Massoudi Pariente, who often chastised the Alliance, but this time it wasn't the Alliance that she was angry with, it was the Protectorate in France. And Massoudi had established a domestic school, training school, which had been taken over by the French Protectorate. And she rightly understood that the French Protectorate had little respect for indigenous Jews, and they were making her life miserable. And finally, when she was ill for a couple of months, they fired her before her contract was up. And she decided to take on the Protectorate and take on the director of education in France, who was a very right-wing conservative man. And she won. And she was given the money she wanted and all of the benefits which she had been deprived of. I loved her little expression at the end of detailing what had taken place. One never anticipated that this little institutrice was going to file a complaint against the director of public instruction, Beaux-Arts and Antiquities. But one sees everything these days, n'est-ce pas? So how can we account for this autonomy? First of all, the early generation of Alliance teachers was a self-selecting group. They were handpicked, and they were also allowed to go by their families, which often meant that they were going to be the sole support for their family. They wouldn't necessarily see their parents again, and they certainly wouldn't be sent home, but they would be able to send the money that they received, or part of it at least, home. So it was a self-selecting group, this pioneering generation. Also, there were virtually no options for them growing up in the towns where they lived, other than domestic service. Second of all, the Alliance was dependent on these women. The Alliance and France as Jews did not have any understanding of what life was like for Jewish girls living in North Africa and the Middle East. They had to rely on these teachers to let them know. And often the teachers were quite clear in letting them know, and also letting them know that they were annoyed that they didn't even have a clue. Their study in Paris was also extremely important. For 4 years, they were living in Paris, and they were being exposed to the early developments of feminism. And I said to you that Hasiba declared herself a feminist, and she said in one instance, "I must confess that as a woman and a feminist, these practices of mourning at the birth of a daughter revolt me." This was in 1900. So in France at the time, the influences of feminism were powerful. The influences of the new woman in France, and not all these new women were feminists, but they defied traditional ideas of femininity in their professions and also in their dress. And the Alliance teachers, the women teachers, kept in contact with France around these issues, and certainly around the sartorial changes that were taking place in France, because they set up workshops in their schools to teach the young girls dressmaking, and they were copying these new dress codes. Of course, it wasn't the intention of the Alliance that these women emerge as autonomously assertive as they were. But the Alliance did, in fact, embrace a form of feminism. It used the term. It was equality with a difference feminism, which the Republicans in France also accepted and embraced. But what the Alliance didn't understand was even this equality with a difference feminism, when translated to North Africa and the Middle East, had a powerfully destabilizing impact, which of course it did not in France. Second of all, the Alliance's appropriation of feminism was linked to its political self-representation in France. All good Republicans were feminists. But the teachers who became feminists were not asserting a connection to a particular country. Their feminism became personal liberation. Finally, it wasn't the intention of the Alliance that its teachers play an independent role in the imperial turn of 19th and 20th century. And this, of course, is a complicated point, and I'll only cover it briefly. It's true that the Alliance teachers could not help but see their students through the Orientalist lens that they had been exposed to in 4 years of education in France. But paradoxically, once they arrived to their post in North Africa and the Middle East, they were inspired over and over again to defy the Alliance's limited vision of the capabilities of the young girls whom they were teaching. And how did the Alliance teachers do this? Well, I'll give you just a few quick examples. As an historian, I love this one, by teaching historical facts. The Alliance wanted these young girls to learn moral lessons. But the teachers fought back, and they said, no, we're teaching them what happened when, accurate history. This will empower them. one example. Another was importing sewing machines. The Alliance said using hands was fine. The Alliance teachers imported sewing machines and knitting machines and set up cottage industries so that the young girls whom they were teaching would be able to earn their own living. Defiance extended also to arguing against the prejudices of the metropole, the prejudices which would appear in just even the terminology used. And finally, defiance appeared in the personal decisions the Alliance teachers made. They were supposed to get permission before they married, and they often did not, but chose to inform the Alliance whom they were marrying. So in conclusion, and this is a very brief overview, the pioneering generation of Alliance teachers, agents in part of the French Empire, although never considered French, had an enduring impact on the young girls of the Orient, especially in the areas of literacy, eradication of child marriage, familiarity with Jewish tradition and history, and the acquisition of skills required to earn a living and maintain a home. A question remains, did they leave footprints beyond their own religious community? Perhaps. I want to quote a Moroccan Muslim woman explaining long after most Jews had emigrated, "Everything new pertaining to women," she said, "we owe to Jewish girls who opened the breaches by letting us believe change was possible." Albeit perhaps hyperbolic, this beckons us to explore as well the broader legacy of the Alliance teachers outside of their own communities. Now I'm going to turn to the third part of my presentation, which is the Dianna Project, which, as I said, emerged from my research on the teachers of the Alliance. And the Dianna Project came to life in a Starbucks in Newton Center. I was having coffee with a friend who had come to my lecture and wanted to talk to me more about it. And he brought with him hundreds of photographs of Jewish places in North Africa. And I said, oh, wouldn't it be wonderful if I could look at all the sites where my teachers went and the schools and get a visual sense of the network. And he said, oh, it's possible. Mind you, this was a very young man. It's very possible. All we need to do is create a multimedia layer on Google Earth, which we did. And we put together within a matter of months a nonprofit organization. And we also, within a matter of months, elicited the support of an incredible array of young men and women, Jewish, Christian, Muslim, all over the world, who volunteered their talents free of charge. So within no time, we were up and running. And my sense was Tom Sawyer couldn't have done it better. We also partnered with other institutions, Wellesley being one of the very first. And we began to send interns from Wellesley to Morocco, Tunisia, Egypt, Turkey, Israel. Our interns also conducted oral interviews and did a great deal of archival research. So I'd like to conclude with a very brief film, 5 minutes, which introduces you to Dianna, takes you on a bit of a virtual tour. And then there's some snippets from an interview with Smart History, which highlights one of the poignant accomplishments of our Dianna team. And then the final little part will be an array of photos of the Alliance teachers and their schools.
Thanks to Dianna's efforts to capture the images, the artifacts, and the oral histories, over 1,200 sites have been identified and are now accessible online. Dianna is the first geo-museum of its kind. With the help of volunteers from across the region, including Arabs, Persians, and Kurds, as well as people of all religious backgrounds, an intense effort is underway to capture visual and oral histories before it is too late. Here, in northern Iraq, we are rediscovering an entire Jewish village. The local elders remember the names of the families that lived there. Here, we see what remains of the synagogue in Accra. And in Saudi Arabia, we discover a complex of forts belonging to an ancient Jewish tribe which played a pivotal role in early Islamic history. Deep in the labyrinths of Sana'a, Yemen, we document the vestiges of Jewish presence despite the chaos of an ongoing civil war. In other countries, peaceful environments allow us to render the full beauty of preserved sites. Witness the striking elegance of the Haim Pinto Synagogue in Essaouira, Morocco. This is heritage worth preserving.
So we're going to talk about the Eliyahu Hanavi Synagogue, which is in Syria, actually in a suburb of Damascus.
The Jewish community in Syria is a storied and ancient one, and this synagogue is one of the most significant synagogues in Syria. There's a scholar, Joseph Miri, who has said that this was the holiest site outside of Jerusalem.
Eliyahu Hanavi Synagogue was destroyed only a few years ago in 2014.
It was caught between the Assad regime forces and the rebel forces. Both sides claim that the other had destroyed the synagogue. It seems clear it was caught in the crossfire from experts that we've consulted.
This is a synagogue dedicated to Elijah and also Elisha, both prophets who are revered in the Judeo-Christian tradition, but also for Muslims, also in the Islamic tradition.
There was a plaque attesting to the prophet Elijah, or Eliyahu, anointing Elisha to be his successor. What we find is that many of these sites that were sacred to Jews are also sacred to Christians and to Muslims. And thanks to this, many of them have been preserved.
This was a very important and beautiful synagogue for centuries, and Jews made pilgrimages there, they worshipped there, miracles were said to have been performed there. I mean, this was a very special place. And like so much synagogue architecture that we see around the world, this very much reflected the time and place that it was built. So the architecture is reminiscent of Ottoman architecture, and the lamps and the tapestries and the kinds of decorative features that we see there.
And its centerpiece was a blue wood-carved teva. The teva is in the Sephardic tradition in the center or in the back of the synagogue. In this case, it's in the center, facing the ark in which the Torah scrolls are located.
So there's so many strands of Jewish history that bring us to this synagogue in the suburbs of Damascus. It seems like a critical time to be documenting these places. We have a population that's aging that can tell us still about these places. We have the turmoil in the Middle East that's endangering the physical traces of Jewish life. And so the work that Dianna is doing is incredibly important.
This synagogue is a poignant and troubling example of the urgency of this work. When we had our researchers there before the uprising, it was beautiful, it was preserved, and it's been looted, it's been destroyed. Now it's even been hit by bombs since the official destruction of it. It's very sad, very troubling for what will remain of cultural heritage in the future.
thank you so much. What an extraordinary lecture. And I think it brings together so many threads of your remarkable career and what you have brought to Wellesley, what you have brought in terms of Jewish studies, and to hear the story of these remarkable women who taught at Allianz across these remarkable places, to bring them to life, to understand who they were and their impact in that historical context. I think gives us that depth of understanding of what Jewish studies is. And Dianna, I think it was both powerful, but also so deeply disturbing to understand how many of these remarkable sites are no longer standing, but what a remarkable thing to have preserved them in history. Fran, thank you, and thank you for all that you've done. I'd like to invite you to please join me on the stage. We have about 15 minutes for questions. And I do believe we're going to bring microphones to the center, and for those who can't necessarily make it, it's going to be hard. Maybe somebody can bring microphones, and if it's possible, can we remove the microphones? Thank you so much. Okay, we have one question back here. And I also
to hear is, I am the product of the Allianz School. Thank you, Fran. I was born in Baghdad, and there were two schools there, two Allianz schools, one for the boys, one for the girls. Of course, my sisters went to the girls' one, I went to the boys' one. However, when I was only 2 or 3 years, we were taken to the girls' school called Azil, and the only women teachers there. And the thing I want to impress upon you is that we studied 4 languages in the Allianz school: Arabic, French, Hebrew, and English. It's amazing how a school like that, with pitiful expenses, could produce so much education and so much knowledge. Fran, I thank you. You brought a lot of memories back. Anybody wants to ask me questions about life up there, they have to ask. Thank you very much.
I'm the second person as a father of Allianz is very But my school had both girls and boys together. We were a little bit ahead of the barbarians from Beirut, Lebanon. My sister also is in Allianz as a universal teacher. And I would like to possibly a little bit present a certain evolution, it seems to me, from what you are describing, which I think you were looking at in the mid-1930s and 40s or 20s.
Or early.
Or earlier.
In the 19th and the very beginning of the 20th century.
Okay, and what I'm going to present very quickly is what was happening in Beirut in the 60s and 50s and 60s. We used to finish the baccalaureate in Beirut and then go for 1 year to France, Paris, to get trained and come back. It really touched me very much the way you're talking about how those women were way ahead of the time. They were very much feminist. My sister and many of the teachers who had been to Paris and back again to teach were ferociously independent, were very much feminist, and they were really pushing the envelope. But also something else, we had male and female teachers going to France to get trained and come back.
Yes.
It's not just
Right. No, I'm sorry if I let.
No, that's fine.
There were men, I just wasn't involved.
You were focusing on the important parts. Anyway, thank you very, very much for your research.
I would love to talk to you at some point.
I'll be happy
It would
to.
be wonderful.
Yeah, my son teaches here, so we have
Well, thank you so much. I regret not being a graduate. My name is Lucia Varia. I'm with the Untitled Project here, but I'm from Istanbul originally. I'm very proud to have a Jewish community in Istanbul since the deportation, the exile of the Sephardic Jews from Spain back in the 15th century. Just a question. In your research, have you also detected anecdotes about the relationship between Jews and Muslims at the time? Because in my understanding, anti-Semitism, which is unfortunately vibrant there, is a late development, it's a modern development in the Middle East. And we have a time that much better coordinated relationship between Jews and Muslims existed for a long time. So I wonder if you have detected any trace of that as well. Thank you so much.
It's a very good question, and it shifts and changes over time. That is, as one moves from the 19th to the 20th century, you are going to get more interactions between Jews and Muslims. And it's also very different depending on where. For example, in Iran, there is a great deal of interaction between Jews and Muslims early on. I didn't find it much in Tetuan, for example. There certainly was an interaction between Jews and Muslims, but not in the school. And Muslim girls were not being educated in these early years in the Alliance schools, certainly in most of the cities in Morocco. On the other hand, there were some Catholic girls in the Alliance schools. But as I said, in Iran, for example, there were Muslim girls being educated more and more, so that in the 30s, there was a fairly large population. Interactions between Muslims and Jews, I think you're absolutely right. I would argue that I don't like to use the term anti-Semitism to describe what might have been problematic relations between Jews and Muslims. I think the term is reserved for something very different. And I do see it as a relatively recent import into the Middle East, and it comes from Europe and has a European trope. But I can't remember now. I was going to say one other thing about the interaction with Muslims and Jews. Sorry, it went out of my head, but thank you. There's a great deal to be said. Oh, I was going to say that in Tetuan, for example, Claire's brother had some very good Muslim friends, and there was interaction, among some of the wealthy Muslim families in Tetuan with some of the wealthier Jewish families. So there is a great deal of that interaction, but because girls were secluded and kept in the home and were relatively illiterate, it was a traditional society. Certainly in Morocco, during this early generation, there was less of an interaction between Jews and Muslims. One final point is when I see Will Roman here, when we were in Morocco and a faculty trip to Morocco, I was speaking to someone from Tetuan, a professor at the university, and he said, if only there was an Alliance school in Tetuan today, I would have my daughters go there.
Excuse me, thank you so much for this wonderful lecture, and I want to just to the point of the last.
Can you actually introduce yourself first?
My name is Laura Mercosin, and I've been an interest and passion in academically for many years. But to the point of the fellow who just asked that question, I am also curious about things I've heard. I don't know if it's true or not true, that at one time the IDF may have incited some pogroms in the Middle East and things like that to kind of scare locals to make Aliyah to Israel to kind of gain more of a population there. I mean, this is not something that would be so foreign to any government. Governments do all kinds of things. So I don't know if that's true or not true, but from my observations, to the point of the last person who spoke, relations were, and I wanted to hear your take on all this, but relations were more deteriorating during the Zionist movement, and that some of the old-timers had mimicked a quote that you said earlier about what happens to one happens to all of us, and many people from these lands were willing to stand next to the European brothers and sisters in support of, during the Holocaust support. So that's just something that's always saddened me a little, not to say there wasn't anti-Semitism inherent in those areas, but I just would like to know more about it from your historical research these things.
Yeah, it's a very, very delicate and complicated question. And to generalize is problematic, but let me just try and generalize a little teeny bit. And that is that there is no doubt that traditional relations in many of these places between Jews and Muslims were much better before colonialism and a creating schism between the experiences of Jews and Muslims, and were much better before as well the emergence of a Zionist movement and the mandate and civil unrest in Palestine, which then radiated out. So it's very hard without, to generalize, because the different places were so different in the experiences of the Jews and the interactions between Jews and Muslims and the shifts over time with the presence of colonial authorities. But let me just say that there were a number of factors exacerbating, which were outside of the control of the Jews and Muslims who were living together, exacerbating tensions and creating barriers. And so one of them would be the presence of an emerging Jewish national home and the unrest in Palestine. But that was only one of the factors. And there were others as well. It's certainly the ways in which Jews and Muslims experienced colonialism and the way the colonial authorities treated these Jews and Muslims. I'll give you one example. The French in Morocco did not want to have the Muslim young girls educated, because then they said, well, then these young girls would get ideas of emancipation. So they didn't even want to support an educational system for them. So, and yet the Jews had their Alliance schools. So the differences were emerging, and they were a result of many variables.
Hi, I'm Susan Meyer in the English department. I had a question about the child marriages. Why exactly would the Alliance have felt that letting married 7 or 8-year-olds attend school would be to endorse child marriage? And was that the Alliance or the individual teachers who thought that? And did some of them resist that idea and let them enroll anyway?
A really good question, and coming from someone who writes beautiful children's books, again, a complicated question. No, well, the teachers themselves felt this way. They were, to a certain extent, indoctrinated into a particular way of looking at the world from their 4 years in Paris and the education. But the Alliance teachers generally let the mothers sit in the back of the classroom. Often the mothers would have children of their own in the class, but they would be in the back getting an education because they wanted to be literate. Basically because in these traditional societies, once you were married, you couldn't go outside. So you were confining this child of 6, 7, or 8 to living in the home, often of her in-laws, and not able to go out at all. You were also preventing this child from learning to read and to write, because there was no one who was going to teach her. So the teachers themselves were against child marriage, generally speaking. The Alliance was also against child marriage. And I think that these young children were, in fact, not just married at this age, but they were taken out of their home, and they had to live in the home of the in-laws. So it was, and incarcerated, basically, in the home. So now, why did they not want to have these children come into school? Because they felt that if they let them come and get a little bit of an education, they were endorsing a practice which would then continue, and they were determined to eradicate child marriage. In fact, Morocco, very early on, can't tell you it's the influence of the Alliance schools, had an age of 18 for marriage. So, but again, not simple answer.
Thank you. Thank you for a most remarkable